The night was quiet. The sky held no moon, only a thin blanket of clouds floating above the dark countryside. A single train moved across the southern tracks, its wheels clicking like a giant metal heartbeat. And somewhere beyond the trees, a shadow watched, waiting, listening. That shadow was Rube Burrow, a name that would soon travel across the nation. Whispered by frightened train crews, shouted by angry sheriffs, and printed in bold letters across American newspapers. But on this night, before he became a legend, he was just a man standing alone beside the rails, hidden in darkness, breathing slow and steady. No one would have guessed that this quiet figure, dressed like any other farmer of the South, would become known as the most dangerous train robber of his time. No one would have imagined that behind his calm face lived a storm one built from loss, hunger, anger, and a deep desire to take control of a world that had taken so much from him. Rube did not start life as a criminal. He started like many others in the late 1800s, poor, hardworking, and hopeful. Born in 1854, in a small rural part of Alabama, he grew up in a family that fought every day just to survive. The Civil War had ended, but hardship still clung to the land like dust on a farmer's boots. Rube learned early that nothing came easy. Every dollar, every meal, every small moment of peace had to be won through sweat and patience. He was not the loud or wild kind. People who knew him as a boy would later say he was gentle, thoughtful, even polite. He helped his parents, protected his siblings, and developed a sharp mind that paid attention to details. Rube was a watcher. He studied things tracks in the dirt, the way people spoke, the way problems could be solved with simple, smart steps. This habit would later make him one of the hardest men to catch in the entire South. As he grew older, Rube searched for a better life. Like many young men of the time, he traveled west toward Texas, hoping to find land, work, and a future worth building. He worked on farms, hauled loads, and earned small wages. Though life was tough, Rube continued forward, believing he could shape something new for himself. Then everything changed. Some stories say it happened fast, like a candle blown out by a sudden wind. Others say it was a long struggle with sickness, one that drained his joy little by little. But no matter the version, the truth remains the same. Rube lost his wife, the woman he loved deeply, the person who kept him grounded. Her death hit him like a silent hammer, breaking the foundation of his world. After that, Rube was not the same Doc. Friends said the light in his eyes dimmed. His smile did not come as easily, and the man who once held hope now carried something heavier inside him, something dark, something restless. Loss does strange things. To a man, especially in a time when life offered no safety nets, no comfort, no place to hide from pain, Rube tried to keep working, tried to stay strong, but grief had hollowed him out. Bills piled up, work grew thin. The world, already unfair, now felt merciless. It was during these hard years that Rube began thinking differently about life. He started to believe that the rules society lived by were built to protect the rich and punish the poor. He watched trains pass by huge iron machines filled with money, valuables, supplies, and power, and he began to wonder why the wealthy railroads held so much while men like him suffered so deeply. These thoughts did not turn him into an outlaw overnight, but they settled in his mind like seeds waiting for the right moment to grow. Then, in 1886, that moment came. Rube had fallen into debt. Work was failing. Hunger crept into the home he shared with his brother and friends, and one cold evening, while the men sat together talking about their troubles, someone spoke the idea aloud. What if we robbed a train? The words hung there, heavy and impossible. Train robbery was no small crime. It was dangerous, it was bold, and it meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But Rube did not laugh. He did not shake his head. Instead, he studied the idea carefully, the way he studied everything. He thought about the schedules, the quiet stretches of track, the small number of guards, the money that rolled through the countryside untouched to the others. It was just talk. But to Rube, it was a plan forming. He spent days watching the tracks, learning the times, studying the terrain. He moved like a hunter, silent and focused. When the night of the first robbery finally arrived, Rube was ready not as a desperate man, but as a strategist. Standing by the tracks, hidden in darkness, He listened for the sound of the incoming train. He felt no fear, just a calm purpose. The faint rumble began to grow. The rails trembled. The whistle echoed across the fields. This was it. This was the moment the farmer became the phantom. When the train came close, Rube raised his hand. His partner stepped out, and in a flash of movement, the robbery began. No chaos, no wild shouting. Rube's voice was steady as he ordered the crew to cooperate. Passengers were not harmed. The guards were disarmed, not injured. Every step was controlled. When it was over, the gang vanished into the trees, leaving behind stunned workers and a mystery that baffled lawmen. A new outlaw had arrived, disciplined, quiet, intelligent, and the South would never forget his name. The newspapers soon wrote the words that would follow him forever. Rube Burrow, the most dangerous train robber in the southern states. But this was only the beginning. The morning after the first train robbery, the sun rose over Texas like any other day, but something in the air felt different. In small towns and dusty ranches, whispers began to spread. People gathered inside local stores, leaning close, speaking in low voices. Someone had robbed a train near Benbrook. Someone bold, someone calm. Someone who left without hurting a soul. No one knew his name yet, but they would. Soon, the whole South would know the name Rube Burrow, while news traveled from mouth to mouth. Rube and his small gang moved through the countryside like shadows. They carried their stolen money in simple bags, hidden under blankets. They did not celebrate loudly or boast about what they had done. Instead, they rode quietly, sticking to back roads, avoiding towns, and speaking only when needed. Rube led them with a steady, thoughtful manner. He did not smile or show excitement. His face stayed calm, almost cold, but not cruel. He was thinking, always thinking about what came next. A single robbery wouldn't change their lives. They needed more if they wanted to escape poverty, debt, and the daily struggle that had driven them to this path. But the moment Rube chose that road, another road opened behind him, one lined with danger, lawmen, and a future he could never fully control. Far away, in the offices of the railroad company, the robbery caused an uproar. Important men slammed papers onto tables. They demanded answers. They wanted the thief caught fast. For them, a train was not just transportation. It was money, power, pride. Having a farmer from Alabama walk onto their train and take their earnings felt like a slap across the face. So they sent word to sheriffs across Texas. Catch this man. Bring him in. Stop him before he strikes again. Rewards were offered. Posses were formed. Newspapers printed every detail they could gather, even though much of it was wrong. Some said the robber was a tall man with sharp eyes. Others said he was short, rough-looking, or possibly a former soldier. The truth was, no one knew. Rube had planned everything too well, but he wasn't finished. Weeks passed, and the gang lived quietly, waiting for things to calm down. Rube watched the world around him, noticing how quickly the robbery had made him a hunted man. Still, he did not regret his choice. In fact, a strange calm settled inside him, a feeling he had not known in years. For the first time since losing his wife, he felt a sense of control. But control is a dangerous comfort. It can trick a man into believing he is untouchable. As 1887 approached, Rube gathered the men again. They sat around a fire in the cold night air. The flames crackled softly, but the tension was loud. Everyone knew what was coming. Rube looked at each of them, speaking in a low, steady tone. "The first job worked because we planned it right," he said. "If we do another, it has to be smarter, faster, cleaner." One of the men shifted uneasily. "They're looking for us, Rube. Every sheriff in the state." "They won't find us," Rube replied. "Not if we stay ahead." His confidence had weight. The others nodded, trusting him completely. And so, the plan for the second robbery began. Rube did not act like the gang's boss. He acted like their guide. He treated each man fairly, listened to their ideas, and made changes when needed. But when it came to the final decisions, everyone knew the truth. Rube was the mind behind the operation. Without him, the gang had no direction. Days before the next robbery, Rube scouted the chosen tracks alone. He rode on horseback, following quiet paths, hiding behind trees, and studying every curve of the rails. He paid attention to train whistles in the distance, memorizing their times. He examined the land, noting places for escape. His eyes missed nothing. A man might stand 10 feet from him and still not notice him move. That was Rube's greatest strength, not brute force, but intelligence. He robbed trains the way a chess player moves pieces, carefully, deliberately, always thinking 2 steps ahead. When the night of the second robbery finally arrived, the gang waited deep inside the woods. Their horses stood tied nearby, nervous and restless. The air was heavy, almost still. Every sound felt louder than usual. The rustling leaves, the snapping twigs, the pounding hearts inside their chests. Then Rube lifted his hand. A signal. The gang froze. And in the distance, the faint rumble of wheels. The train was coming. The men took their positions, with quiet precision. Rube stood near the tracks, hidden behind a thick tree. He watched the dark horizon until a glow of lanterns appeared. The train roared closer, lighting the rails in front of it. Rube stepped forward at the perfect moment. Everything happened fast, too fast for the crew to react. The gang boarded the train, again using no unnecessary violence. They forced the guards to surrender and moved through the cars with calm authority. No yelling, no threats, no panic. It was silent, organized, and shockingly smooth. When the robbery ended, the gang slipped away into the night. The train crew, shaken but unharmed, had no idea who the mysterious leader was. All they remembered was his calm voice, his steady hands, and the way he always seemed 1 step ahead. By morning, towns across the region were buzzing again. 2 robberies. Same style, same mystery. Whispers grew louder. Who is this man? Why can't they catch him? He moves like a ghost. And the newspapers finally gave him a name that would stick. The Phantom Train Robber. But Rube Burrow was not a ghost. He was flesh and blood, a man with pain in his heart, a plan in his mind, and the entire South on his trail. And this was only the beginning of his long, dangerous journey. Rube Burrow's second train robbery spread across the South like wildfire. Every newspaper carried the story. Every sheriff studied the details. And every railroad owner felt a chill run down his spine. The robber wasn't sloppy, wild, or foolish. He was patient. He was careful. He was smart. And that made him far more dangerous than any outlaw the region had ever faced. The newspapers gave him a new title, the Phantom Train Robber. Some even compared him to Jesse James, though Jesse's days of crime were already fading into legend. Rube was the new threat, modern, unpredictable, and impossible to track. But while the world talked, Rube remained quiet. He traveled through forests and back roads with a small gang, using hidden trails to avoid anyone who might recognize them. Rube understood that the true secret to survival was movement. Outlaws who stayed still were outlaws who died early. After the second robbery, the gang kept their heads down for several weeks. They stayed in abandoned cabins, friendly farms, and thick stretches of woods. They ate simple meals, slept in shifts, and avoided speaking about their crimes. But inside their minds, thoughts spun like wheels on a track. They had money now, but money runs out, and life as an outlaw had a strange effect. Once a man crossed the line, the road behind him disappeared. There was no returning to normal life, no settling down, no simple peace. Rube understood this better than anyone. The robberies had not brought him joy, but they had given him something else, a feeling of control that had been missing since the death of his wife. For the first time in years, he felt strong. He felt capable. He felt needed by the men who followed him, and that feeling kept him going. Still, the risks were rising. Railroad companies hired private detectives, most famously, the Pinkerton. These men were trained to track outlaws across states, across borders, across mountains and rivers. They used maps, spies, informants, and traps. They studied patterns and details, just like Rube did. But one thing made Rube difficult to catch. He had no pattern. Each robbery took place in a different location, at a different time, using different methods. Rube changed everything: routes, hideouts, tactics. He left no clues behind because he refused to repeat himself. Even the Pinkertons had to admit, quietly and reluctantly, that this man from Alabama was smarter than most. Criminals they hunted, but being smart did not protect him from everything. Inside the gang, Small cracks began to show. One of the younger members grew nervous. He could barely sleep at night, afraid that lawmen would burst through the door at any moment. Another man wanted more money and less danger. He pushed Rube to take bigger chances, rob more trains, move faster. This created tension. Rube listened, but did not bend. "Rushing is how men die," he said calmly. "We do this on my terms." Most of the men respected him. Though he wasn't loud or aggressive, Rube carried a quiet authority. He never raised his voice. He never panicked. He kept his mind steady, even when things seemed ready to fall apart. But he was not blind. He saw the fear growing in the gang. He knew some men lacked the strength for a long outlaw life. Still, he needed them. A train robbery wasn't something one man could pull off alone. So he began planning again. This time, the stakes were higher. Rube chose tracks in Mississippi, remote, dark, and lightly guarded. He spent days studying the area, hiding in bushes, watching the shadows move across the ground. He walked miles along the rails, memorizing every turn of the landscape. No one planned a crime the way Rube did. When he returned to the gang, he laid out the details calmly, step by step. There was no rush, no confusion. Everyone knew their role. The night of the third robbery came with heavy clouds and a cold wind. The men waited behind a line of oak trees, their horses tied to branches, their faces tight with nervous hope. Rube stood slightly apart, watching the empty track stretch into darkness. He felt a familiar calm settle over him. The world around him grew quiet to quiet. Only his heartbeat and the distant hum of the approaching train filled his ears. Then, at the perfect time, he lifted his hand. The signal. The gang moved like pieces on a board, stepping out of the trees, taking positions exactly as Rube had ordered. The train roared closer, its lanterns glowing like floating stars. Steam hissed, wheels clattered, and the great iron machine slowed under the sudden force of the gang's blockade. Rube moved first. He climbed aboard with the same confidence he had shown in the earlier robberies. The crew recognized the style immediately. Calm voice, controlled steps, polite but firm commands. "It's him," one guard whispered. The Phantom, the robbery was clean, efficient, almost silent. Rube made sure no one was harmed. He believed hurting people created chaos, and chaos created mistakes. And Rube Burrow did not make mistakes. When the gang disappeared into the night, the train crew felt as though they had seen something unreal, something professional, something chilling. By sunrise, the entire region buzzed with fresh rumors. 3 robberies, 3 escapes, no clues. Sheriffs began calling him the smartest outlaw they had ever chased. Farmers told stories about a man who robbed the rich but spared the poor. Children pretended to be Rube Burrow while playing in dusty yards, but the truth was far more complicated. Rube wasn't a hero. He wasn't a monster either. He was a man shaped by grief, sharpened by hardship, and driven into darkness by a world that gave him no second chances. Yet with every robbery, he stepped deeper into a life he could not escape. And with every headline, his name traveled farther, until even strangers felt like they knew him. A legend was forming, but legends come at a price, and soon. That price would begin to show. As Rube Burrow's name spread across the South, something unusual began to happen. In the towns and farms where news traveled slowly, people started talking about him not only with fear, but with curiosity, even admiration. They said he was polite during robberies. They said he never harmed innocent people. They said he shared money with families who were struggling, slipping coins or small bills into the hands of the poor, before disappearing again into the trees. These stories grew with every retelling, turning Rube from a simple outlaw into a mysterious figure, half criminal, half folk hero. But fame is a double-edged knife. The more people admired him, the more others wanted him caught. Railroad companies were furious. They had lost thousands of dollars. Their guards felt humiliated. Their passengers were terrified, and the owners wanted justice fast, loud, and unforgiving. They put up posters in every town. Wanted Rube Burrow, reward for capture. Each poster showed a rough sketch of his face, though none were exactly right. Rube didn't look like a monster. He looked like a normal man, calm eyes, strong jaw, simple clothes. It made him even harder to identify. While the posters spread, Rube and his gang hid deep in the woods of Mississippi. They traveled at night and rested during the day, always careful to leave no trace. They buried trash, covered boot prints, and avoided campfires unless absolutely necessary. Rube was strict about these rules. Carelessness meant capture. Capture meant death, and Rube Burrow was not ready to die. Still, the gang grew restless, living in hiding wears on a man's nerves. Days blurred together. Food was hard to find. Every distant sound a snapping twig. A rustling leaf felt like a threat. One of the younger men, Jim, spoke up one evening as they rested in an abandoned cabin. "Rube," he said quietly, "how long can we keep this up? They're hunting us everywhere. Pinkertons, sheriffs, even bounty hunters." Rube stared into the dim light coming through the broken window. His face showed no fear, only deep thought. "As long as we need to," he answered. "They won't catch us if we stay smart." "But the money's running low," Jim argued. "We need another job." Rube knew he was right. Their pockets were growing lighter. Supplies were thin. And once a man becomes an outlaw, ordinary work is no longer an option. No farmer or rancher would hire someone with a price on his head, so once again, Rube started planning. This time, he wanted a job that would send a stronger message, robbery that would shake the railroad owners to their core. He studied routes across Alabama and Louisiana, searching for a weak point in the system. He noticed something important. Some trains carried special express packages, small but filled with large amounts of money. Those were the targets. Rube chose a remote area near the Alabama state line. Tall trees surrounded the track. The land sloped downward, creating a natural hiding place. The location was perfect, too isolated for quick help, too shadowed for anyone to see an ambush coming. For 3 nights, Rube watched the track from a distance. He learned the timing by listening to the whistles echo across the valley. The train passed like clockwork, its lanterns glowing softly through the trees. On the 4th night, he returned to the gang. "I've found the place," he said simply. The men trusted his judgment. They had seen his plans succeed again and again. Still, a quiet tension hung over them. This job felt different, bigger, riskier. But there was no turning back. When the night of the robbery arrived, the air was cool and heavy with mist. The men waited silently in the shadows, their breaths forming pale clouds. The moon hid behind a sheet of clouds, giving them the darkness they needed. Rube crouched near the track, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then far away a faint hum grew louder. The train was coming. As the sound grew, Rube felt a familiar calm settle inside him. Fear did not guide him. Emotion did not shake him. His mind worked like a machine, clear, sharp, focused. The lantern lights appeared first, bouncing gently with the rhythm of the rails. The giant iron engine followed, hissing and roaring like a living creature. Rube raised his hand. The gang moved. A fallen tree, prepared earlier, rolled onto the tracks. The train screeched as brakes fought to stop it. Sparks flew. Metal screamed. The machine slowed just enough for the gang to climb aboard. The crew recognized the method instantly. "It's him." A guard shouted, "It's the Phantom." But shouting did nothing. Within minutes, Rube controlled the situation completely. His voice stayed calm as he ordered the guards to open the express car. No one was hurt. No shots were fired. Rube simply used intelligence and confidence to stay in charge. Inside the express car, the men found what they were looking for: stacked packages containing large sums of money. This was a heavy blow to the railroad company. When the gang rode away into the night, the shocked train crew stood frozen, too stunned to speak. They knew they had witnessed something historic. By dawn, newspapers rushed to print fresh headlines. "Burrow strikes a GAIN. Outlaw humiliates railroad company." Some stories praised his precision. Some exaggerated his actions. Some even invented lies to sell papers. But all agreed on one thing: Rube Burrow was no longer just an outlaw. He was a legend growing in real time. Back in the woods, the gang celebrated quietly. They ate a proper meal for the first time in weeks. Spirits were higher. Money was no longer a problem at least for now. But Rube remained serious. He understood something the others did not. The bigger the robberies, the bigger the target on his back, lawmen would not rest. Pinkertons would not quit. Bounty hunters would not sleep. Rube stared into the forest, listening to the wind move through the trees. He knew the truth. He was becoming famous. Yes, but fame was the shadow of danger, and danger was now following him more closely than ever. For weeks after the Alabama robbery, the South buzzed with non-stop talk. Newspapers printed long columns describing the boldness of the crime. Travelers spoke nervously on trains. Sheriffs gathered extra deputies. Railroad companies demanded action, furious at how easily Rube Burrow had struck again and slipped away without a trace. The story had spread so far that even people in states Rube had never visited knew his name. Some spoke it with admiration. Others spoke it with anger. But everyone agreed on one thing. Rube Burrow was becoming a problem too big to ignore. Inside law offices and sheriff stations, maps lay open across tables. Pins were pushed into routes where Rube might travel. Rewards were raised. Warnings were printed. But even with all this effort, no one had a real clue where he was hiding. Rube, meanwhile, stayed deep in the woods with his small gang. They moved often, sometimes twice, in one night, to avoid leaving patterns behind. Rube believed a pattern was the quickest path to capture. He changed everything. Their sleeping spots, the roads they used, even the order they traveled in. But as the pressure grew, something else began to change. The men themselves. The gang, once united by desperation, now felt fear rising inside them like floodwater. They jumped at shadows. They whispered about bounty hunters. They argued about money and risks. And the more famous Rube became, the more nervous the others grew. One afternoon, as the men rested inside an abandoned barn, the oldest gang member, a man named Carver, spoke with a tired voice. "Rube," he said, rubbing his eyes, "you know they won't stop looking for us. Every sheriff wants your head on a wall." Rube didn't look up from the map he was studying. "They won't find us if we stay smart." Jim, the youngest, shook his head. "But what if one of us slips? What if someone talks? They're offering rewards bigger than anything we're carrying." A quiet tension filled the dusty barn. Rube finally lifted his eyes. His voice was calm, but firm. "No one here is talking." But as he said the words, he noticed something. The men did not look reassured. Their trust was weakening, little by little. Still, Rube did not blame them. Living as an outlaw was hard. Fear was a constant companion, and the louder the world shouted his name, the more dangerous every step became. To ease the tension, Rube decided they should move again farther west this time, where lawmen weren't yet searching. He believed distance could buy them time, but he also knew time was a fragile thing. It could slip away with one mistake. Over the next weeks, they traveled through dense forests, across muddy rivers, and through abandoned backroads. They camped in quiet valleys and old hunting cabins. Rube kept watch at night, listening to the wind and the distant calls of animals, making sure no footsteps approached their shelter. But the world outside was changing. The railroad companies had pushed hard, and now the Pinkerton detectives were more determined than ever. They interviewed townspeople. They traced small clues. They questioned anyone who had ever known Rube. Even distant relatives found themselves facing lawmen knocking at their doors. One detective, a man named Stroud, studied the pattern of robberies and made a discovery. He strikes where the rails are weak. Stroud told a sheriff. He picks isolated places where help can't come quickly. This was true, but knowing how Rube thought did not make catching him easier. He was too careful, too quiet, too fast. He left no trail behind. But lawmen had one weapon that could break even the strongest outlaw: pressure on family. Rube's family still lived in Alabama. They were hard-working, simple people, not involved in crime, not part of his gang. But the law didn't care about that. If Rube visited them, even briefly, they wanted to know. So sheriffs watched the Burrow family closely. They followed them in town, questioned neighbors, inspected letters, and even camped near the house at night. Rube knew this. He understood the danger. But family is a powerful pull. As the months passed, he missed them more. He wanted to hear familiar voices, eat a warm meal, feel a moment of peace that life on the run never gave him. And so, one night, against his better judgment, Rube went home. He arrived quietly, slipping into the house long after midnight. His sister gasped when she saw him, not in fear, but in shock and worry. His mother cried softly, touching his face like he was still the young boy she had raised. For a few brief hours, Rube felt human again, not an outlaw, not a hunted man, not a legend, just a son, a brother, a tired soul seeking comfort. But danger followed him like a shadow. A neighbor, seeing a strange horse near the house at dawn, grew suspicious. He knew the Burrows were under watch, and he knew the reward for Rube's capture could change his life. By noon, a sheriff's posse was on the way. Rube heard them before he saw them, the distant thumping of hooves. He reacted instantly. "It's the law," he whispered. "I have to go." His mother grabbed his arm. "Rube, they'll kill you." But he slipped away. Moving through the woods behind the house, with the quiet skill of a man who had spent years learning to disappear, the posse searched all afternoon. But Rube was gone long before they arrived. That incident taught him the harshest truth yet. Seeing his family meant risking their lives and his own. From that day on, Rube stayed far from Alabama, carrying the heavy weight of separation like a stone inside his chest. Meanwhile, the gang noticed the world tightening around them. Rewards grew higher. Posters spread wider. Every robbery increased the danger. Every rumor increased the hunt. And yet, despite all this pressure, Rube continued planning. He believed there were still opportunities ahead, still chances to strike, survive, and stay free. But the noose around him was tightening. The law was learning his habits. People were becoming desperate for reward money, and cracks inside the gang were growing wider. The legend of Rube Burrow was rising, but so was the storm that would one day bring him down. As the months passed, Rube Burrow's gang continued moving through the South like ghosts. They followed hidden trails, slept in abandoned shacks, and avoided towns unless absolutely necessary. But even though they were free, they lived with a constant weight pressing down on them, a weight made of fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that every lawman in the South wanted them behind bars, or dead. Rube noticed it first in the way the men walked. Their steps were slower, heavier. Their eyes were tired, always watching the edges of the woods for danger. Nights felt longer, days felt shorter, and the silence between the gang members grew thicker than the forest around them. What once felt like strength moving as one, thinking as one, now felt fragile. One evening, after a long day of travel, the gang camped beside a shallow creek. The water trickled gently, but it wasn't enough to calm the tension in the air. As the men sat around the dim fire, Carver, the oldest of the group, looked at Rube with a face worn down by months of running. "Rube," Carver said, "we can't keep living like this. Every day feels like we're a step from being caught." Jim nodded. His young face showed fear that he could no longer hide. "I don't sleep anymore," he admitted. "Every sound wakes me up." Rube listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scold. Instead, he studied their expressions, the doubt in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, the cracks forming in their courage. Finally, he said softly, "This life was never meant to be easy, but we're still here because we stayed smart. The law hasn't caught us yet." Carver frowned. "Yet, Rube, yet they're getting closer. The Pinkertons say you're the biggest outlaw in 3 states. That's not something we can hide from forever." Rube didn't respond immediately. He poked a fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. He understood their fear. He felt it too, though he never let it show. But what bothered him most wasn't their fear, it was the way the fear was beginning to change them. A gang could survive hunger. A gang could survive cold nights. But a gang rarely survived doubt. The next morning, Rube gathered the men before sunrise. The sky was pale, quiet, and empty. "We move west," he said firmly. "There's less pressure there. Fewer sheriffs. More places to hide." The men agreed, though their voices lacked the strength they once carried. Still, they followed Rube. Even in fear, they trusted him more than they trusted themselves. As they traveled for days, the forests grew thicker and the land wilder. They crossed swamps where the air smelled heavy and old. They rode past abandoned cabins swallowed by vines. They lived on dried meat, cornbread, and whatever they could hunt. But no matter how far they went, they couldn't escape the truth. The law was closing in the towns they passed. They overheard whispers in saloons and stores. Burrow's gang robbed again. Say the reward's big enough to buy farm. My cousin saw men searching the woods. Yesterday, these whispers followed, them like shadows. Rube didn't show worry, but he felt the pressure tightening around him. More than once, he caught members of the gang staring at him with uncertain eyes, filled with questions they were too afraid to ask. One night, as the men slept, Rube sat awake under a leaning cedar tree. He watched the moonlight flicker through the branches, painting silver shapes across the ground. He thought about his life before the robberies, the farm work, the quiet evenings, the dreams he once believed in. He thought about his wife, her smile, her laughter, the way her presence steadied him. That life was gone now, swallowed by grief and replaced by a path he never planned to follow. Everything he was now an outlaw, a leader. A hunted man felt like a shadow of the person he once hoped to become. But there was no going back. He had crossed the line long ago. While Rube sat thinking, he didn't notice that someone else was awake too. Jim. The young man watched Rube from across the dark camp, fear and loyalty battling inside him. Jim admired Rube. He trusted him. But he also feared the fate of outlaws. He had seen the posters. He had heard the stories. He knew how these tales usually ended. The next day, as the gang rode through a narrow trail, Jim's horse slowed. He fell behind the others until he was several yards back. Carver noticed. "Jim, you good back there?" Jim didn't answer. His eyes were distant. His thoughts were heavier than ever, and inside his mind, a dangerous idea had begun to form. The reward for Rube's capture was enormous, more money than Jim had ever seen, more money than any poor young man could dream of earning honestly. And as fear grew stronger than loyalty, betrayal began to whisper inside him like a cold voice. Rube glanced back and noticed Jim's troubled expression. "Stay close," he told him. Jim forced a nod, but the doubt didn't fade. It grew. Over the next week, the gang continued moving west, pulling off small robberies to stay afloat. But something was different. Now Rube could feel it. The conversations were shorter. The laughter was gone, and Jim avoided meeting Rube's eyes. One evening, while gathering firewood, Carver pulled Rube aside. "There's something wrong with that boy," he muttered. "He's scared out of his mind. Scared men do stupid things." Rube sighed. "He's young. He'll calm down." Carver shook his head. "Young men are the first ones to break." Rube didn't want to believe that. Jim had been loyal from the beginning. He trusted Jim, or he wanted to. But deep inside, Rube felt the shift too. Fear was not just following them. It was entering the group from within. The gang didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous threat was no longer the Pinkertons or the sheriffs. The danger was sitting beside them at every campfire. And soon, one man's fear would change everything. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Though the gang moved west as Rube instructed, the air around them felt different, thicker, colder, and full of something that none of them dared to say out loud. Distrust. It leaked into conversations. It hung between the men like smoke, and even when no one spoke, Rube could feel it growing. They traveled across long stretches of wilderness, crossing dried riverbeds and winding paths that only hunters knew. Their horses grew thinner. Their supplies barely lasted. And every night, when they stopped to rest, the silence between them grew louder. Jim, the youngest member, was the most changed. Once loyal, once eager, he now rode with hunched shoulders and eyes that darted nervously from tree to tree. When Rube looked at him, Jim quickly looked away. Rube tried to ignore it. He told himself Jim was simply tired or frightened. Life on the run could wear down even the strongest men. But something deeper had shifted inside the boy. Something Rube could not fix with calm words or careful planning. One afternoon, as they stopped at a creek to water their horses, Rube caught Jim whispering to Carver. Their voices were low, but their expressions gave away the truth. They were talking about escape, or something worse. Carver walked over to Rube afterward, his face tight. "You're losing him," Carver said in a low voice. "Jim's not built for this life. He's cracking apart." Rube stared at the water, moving slowly over the stones. "I know," he said quietly, "but he's part of the gang. He won't betray us." Carver raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Rube wanted to be sure, but the truth lay heavy in his chest. He wasn't, that night. As the gang camped in a stretch of thick pine woods, the air felt still too still. Even the insects seemed quiet. The fire crackled, glowing orange against the dark trees. The men sat around it silently. Jim avoided the light, sitting just outside the circle of fire, his face half hidden in the shadows. Rube watched him for a long time. Every now and then, Jim's fingers tapped nervously against his knee, like he was waiting for something or planning something. Carver finally broke the silence. "We need supplies. Food, ammo. We're running low." Rube nodded. "Tomorrow, we ride into a town. Not a big one. Just enough to get what we need." The others nodded, but Jim stiffened at the mention of town. His breath caught for a moment. Rube noticed. The boy was terrified, not of the law, but of what he might do. By morning, the gang reached a tiny settlement, a quiet place with a general store, a blacksmith, and a single dusty road running through it. They tied their horses behind the store and entered one by one. Keeping their hats low. Inside, an old storekeeper greeted them with a friendly nod. He had no idea that 3 of the most wanted men in the South were standing in front of him. Rube stayed calm as he bought flour, dried meat, bullets, and matches. His voice was steady. His hands did not shake. He looked like any other traveler. But Jim couldn't hide his fear. His hands trembled so badly that he dropped a can of beans. It rolled across the wooden floor, clattering loudly. The storekeeper looked at him with confusion, then suspicion. "You all right, son?" he asked. Jim swallowed hard. "Why, yeah, I'm fine." But Rube saw the panic building behind the boy's eyes. Jim was on the edge. One wrong breath, one wrong question, and he might break completely. As they left the store, Rube pulled Jim aside. "Talk to me," Rube said quietly. "What's going on with you?" Jim shook his head quickly. "Nothin', Rube, I'm fine." Rube placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're scared. I get that. But we're in this together." Jim stepped back, avoiding Rube's eyes. That was the moment Rube understood. Jim was slipping away from him. They returned to the woods before sunset, carrying supplies. The gang set up camp beneath a group of tall pine trees. Smoke from the fire curled upward into the branches. As the men ate their meal, Rube watched Jim carefully. The boy barely touched his food. His eyes flicked toward the trail behind him, as though he expected someone to appear at any moment. And then, sometime after midnight, something happened that confirmed Rube's worst fear. Rube woke suddenly, a strange instinct pulling him from sleep. One look at the camp told him everything. Jim's blanket was empty. Jim's horse was gone. Jim had slipped away into the night. Carver woke next, cursing under his breath. "He's running, Rube. I knew it." Rube stood silently for several seconds, staring into the dark forest where Jim had disappeared. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was simply disappointed, but disappointment didn't change the truth. A frightened boy was now out there, alone, with knowledge that could destroy them all. Carver stepped beside him. "If he talks, we're done." Rube didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth hung heavy in the silence. Jim wasn't just running for safety. He was running toward something, toward people who could offer him money, protection, or a chance to escape his outlaw life. Jim was running toward the law, and once he reached them, the hunt for Rube Burrow would change forever. Rube stared into the trees long after the others returned to sleep. His mind raced, but his face remained calm. He had survived train robberies. He had survived sheriffs. He had survived Pinkerton detectives. But betrayal from one of his own, that was a different kind of danger. The kind that tore gangs apart from the inside. The kind that couldn't be outrun. The kind that whispered one chilling truth. The beginning of the end had arrived. Jim rode hard through the darkness, branches scratching his arms, cold wind burning his eyes. Fear pushed him forward faster than the horse could comfortably run. He didn't stop to rest. He didn't look back. He just rode, driven by panic, exhaustion, and the heavy weight of the reward posters he could no longer ignore. Behind him, miles away, Rube Burrow stood in the quiet forest with his remaining gang members. The night was silent except for the crackle of their dying fire and the distant hoot of an owl. But inside that silence lay something darker, a truth they couldn't escape. Jim was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Carver paced near the fire, muttering angrily, "That boy's gone straight to the law. You know it, Rube. He'll hand us over for a few $100s. Rube didn't answer. He stared into the darkness, thinking. His calmness frustrated Carver, who finally stopped pacing and glared at him. "We have to move," Carver insisted. "Now, before they're on us." Rube nodded slowly. "Yes, we move at dawn. But dawn might be too late." Carver snapped. Rube looked at him with steady eyes. "Traveling at night makes noise. It leaves traces. We wait until light." Carver clenched his jaw, but said nothing more. Deep down, he knew Rube was right. Rube always had a reason for every choice, every step, every move. That was why they had survived this long. But this time felt different. This time, the danger was smarter, closer, and carrying familiar footsteps. Meanwhile, Jim reached a small town just before sunrise. His horse was covered in sweat and shaking from exhaustion. Jim stumbled into the sheriff's office, pale and trembling. The sheriff looked up from his desk, confused. "You look like you've seen death itself." "What are you doing here, son?" Jim swallowed hard. "It's Rube Burrow," he whispered. "I know where he is." The sheriff froze. The room became still. Pinkerton detectives were called in within hours. Maps were unrolled. Routes were drawn. Questions were fired at Jim like bullets. "Where is he? How many men? What weapons? How long ago did you leave him?" Jim answered everything. His voice shook. His chest tightened. But the fear of dying as an outlaw overpowered every drop of loyalty he once had. The detectives nodded, studying the details. They weren't excited. They weren't panicked. They were calculating. "Burrow is tired," one Pinkerton said. "His gang is weak. This is our chance." The sheriff agreed. "We ride tonight." By late afternoon, a posse of armed men was formed: lawmen, Pinkertons, and bounty hunters, hungry for reward money. Horses were saddled. Guns were loaded. And with Jim riding beside them, pointing the way, they began the journey toward Rube's last known location. The trap had officially closed. Back in the forest, Rube and Carver prepared to move. They packed their supplies, saddled their horses, and erased every sign of their camp. Rube always made sure they covered footprints, scattered ashes, and avoided leaving anything that could betray their presence. But even he sensed that this time, it might not be enough. As they headed west, the forest felt unusually tense. Birds flew away suddenly. Leaves rustled, though no wind blew. Rube's instincts sharpened those instincts that had saved him countless times. "Someone's human," he whispered. Carver's hand tightened on his gun. "Jim's done it." Rube didn't respond. He simply signaled for silence and led the horses deeper between the trees. They moved slowly, carefully, listening for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed. The sun lowered, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The men stopped to rest near a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow path far below. From that ridge, they saw dust, rising horses. Riders. A posse. Carver swore under his breath. There they are. Rube crouched beside a tree, watching the distant figures move along the trail. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. But his voice stayed calm. "They're following Jim's directions," he said. "We can't stay here." Carver looked at him. "What now?" Rube studied the landscape. The ridge was high and steep, but behind them lay a tangle of cliffs, caves, and narrow passes. Dangerous terrain, but difficult to track anyone through. "We go into the hills," Rube decided. "They won't be able to follow easily." Carver nodded. "Good. Let the rocks slow them down." Rube mounted his horse, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something unusual tightening in his chest. Not fear, not anger, but sadness, the sadness of realizing that one of his own had turned him in. Jim had been like a younger brother. Rube had protected him, taught him, trusted him. Now that trust had become a dagger pointing at his back. The posse moved quickly. Jim rode near the sheriff, pointing out fresh tracks and broken branches. He was shaken with nerves, but the lawmen encouraged him. "You're doing the right thing," one said. "You'll be free after this," another promised. But inside Jim's heart, guilt grew like a heavy stone. He knew Rube had never treated him cruelly. He knew Rube had tried to calm his fears, and yet, here he was, guiding armed men straight to him. Still, Jim pushed the guilt aside. He wanted freedom. He wanted safety. He wanted a life not filled with gunshots and midnight flights through the woods, but deep inside, another truth whispered quietly. He had betrayed the only man who ever believed in him. As night fell, Rube and Carver navigated the rugged hills. The rocks cut their boots. The horses struggled. Their bodies ached from exhaustion. Finally, they stopped in a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. Carver leaned against the wall. "We ain't losing them, Rube. They're too close." Rube sat quietly, staring at the cave floor. His mind was working fast, planning, calculating, analyzing. "We're not done yet," he said softly, "but we need to be smarter than ever." Carver nodded, trusting him even now. With danger closing in from all sides, Rube listened to the distant echoes of hoofbeats bouncing off the hills. The end was coming. He could feel it, but he wasn't ready to surrender his freedom. Not yet. And as the first stars appeared overhead, one thought filled his mind. The fight for survival had truly begun. The night settled cold and heavy around the hills as Rube, Burrow, and Carver rested inside the small cave hidden by vines. The air inside was damp. The ground was hard, but it was the only shelter they had, and both men knew they were out of choices. Outside, the wind pushed through the rocks with a low, hollow sound, almost like a warning, whispering that danger was only steps away. Rube sat with his back against the stone wall, listening. He could hear faint echoes from far below, voices, horse hooves, the clatter of metal. The posse was still searching. They were climbing the hills. They were getting closer. Carver rubbed his tired eyes. "We can't outrun M forever, Rube." Rube didn't argue. He knew it was true. For the first time since he became an outlaw, he could feel the battle turning against him. The hills offered hiding places, but they also trapped him. Every exit seemed blocked by men ready to claim the reward for his capture. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. "We wait for dawn," Rube said softly. "Then we move north. There's another ridge we can cross. Hard trail, but it'll slow them." Carver nodded. He trusted Rube's judgment. Even now, with danger all around them, Rube's voice stayed calm, steady, strong just like it always had. But inside his chest, Rube felt something he had never felt before, a sense of finality. He had escaped sheriffs, Pinkertons, bounty hunters, and traps for years. But betrayal from Jim had given the lawmen something they had never had before. They weren't guessing anymore. They were hunting with purpose. Rube closed his eyes and took a slow breath. His life had become a long chain of stolen nights, lonely trails, and close escapes. He had chosen this path, yes, but now the path was narrowing, pulling him toward something he could not avoid. Down below, the posse continued its climb. Jim rode silently, avoiding the other men's eyes. Guilt weighed heavily on him. He had betrayed Rube to save himself, but the closer they got, the heavier his guilt became. Pinkerton Stroud noticed Jim's pale face and nervous movements. "Stay focused," Stroud said sharply. "We're close. Burrow's in these hills. You know that." Jim swallowed hard. "I know," but in his heart, he wondered if he had made the worst mistake of his life. The posse spread out, forming a wide circle around the hill. Lanterns glowed faintly in the darkness. Guns were held ready. The net was closing. As the first light of dawn crept across the hills, Rube and Carver prepared to move. They left the cave quietly, leading their horses by hand to avoid making noise. The sky glowed pale blue, and the air carried the cold promise of morning. But before they could mount, the sound they dreaded rolled across the hills, a distant shout, a signal, a warning. They found the cave, Carver whispered. Rube nodded. "We move fast." They mounted their horses and pushed forward along a narrow ledge overlooking a deep ravine. Rocks crumbled under the hooves. The trail was dangerous, but Rube knew it well. He had scouted it earlier, knowing they might need it. Behind them, the posse surged up the hill. Riders shouted. Dogs barked. The law was no longer searching blindly, they were chasing. Carver looked back. Their gain. "Stay steady," Rube said, urging his horse forward. The narrow trail ended at a place where the ridge split into two paths, one leading deeper into the hills, the other descending toward a small valley. Rube headed for the valley. He hoped moving downward would confuse the trackers, but the terrain was steep, covered with loose stones and dry soil. Carver's horse stumbled. He grabbed the saddle tightly, trying to stay balanced. "Go on, Rube," he yelled. "I'll catch up." Rube turned, refusing to leave him. "Keep going. You're fine." Carver urged his horse forward again, but the delay cost them precious time. The posse's shouts grew louder, hoofbeats thundered across the ridge. They were too close. Rube and Carver reached the valley floor, a small stretch of dry grass bordered by thin trees. They pushed toward the far edge, where a creek cut through the land. But before they reached it, gunfire cracked through the morning. Bullets snapped through the branches. Carver ducked low. They found us. Rube looked around quickly. The creek was too narrow to hide them. The open valley offered no cover. They needed to find a place to disappear fast. He pointed toward a cluster of thick bushes. There. They urged their horses into the brush, but the posse was already pouring down the hill, spreading out like a wave. Lanterns swung. Guns glinted. Shouting echoed across the valley. Carver grabbed Rube's arm. "We can't fight all of them." Rube's jaw tightened. "We're not fighting. We're getting out." He jumped from his horse and slid down the embankment toward the creek. Carver followed, stumbling on the loose dirt. The two men crouched low, using the tall grass as cover, but the posse was closing in. The grass shifted above them. Footsteps crunched. Hooves pounded. Carver whispered their every direction. Rube closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. This wasn't fear, this was calculation. Even now, cornered, he was thinking. "There's a way," Rube said quietly. "We make for the old barn, north of here. It's half collapsed. If we reach it, we might lose them." Carver stared at him. "Rube, that barn's miles away." Rube nodded. "We move fast. But if they see us, they won't," Rube said firmly. "We go through the creek. It'll hide our tracks." Carver hesitated, but finally nodded. "All right, lead the way." They slipped into the shallow water, moving quickly but quietly. The cold creek splashed against their boots. The water masked their footprints, giving them a small chance, maybe the last chance they would ever have. Behind them, the posse spread out across the valley, searching every corner, every shadow, every patch of grass. Pinkerton Stroud dismounted near the creek and crouched down, studying the ground. "They're close," he said. "We keep pushing." Jim stood behind him, heart pounding, wondering what would happen when they finally caught Rube. Would he regret his betrayal? Would Rube look at him with anger or disappointment? Jim didn't know, but the chase was reaching its climax, and somewhere up the creek, soaked and exhausted, Rube Burrow kept moving, still fighting, still thinking, still refusing to surrender his freedom. The valley grew quiet, holding its breath. The end was approaching, and Rube could feel it in every step. Rube, Burrow, and Carver moved through the cold water of the creek, their clothes soaked and heavy. The morning sunlight spread slowly across the valley, lighting the hills behind them. The posse was close, so close they could hear distant shouts echoing off the rocks. But Rube didn't stop. He didn't panic. He simply pushed forward with the same calm determination that had kept him alive through every robbery, every chase, every dangerous night. Carver followed closely, stumbling at times, but staying upright. His breath came out in sharp gasps. "Rube, I don't think we can outrun them much longer." Rube looked ahead. His eyes, tired but focused, scanned the land. "We don't outrun them. We outthink them." He pointed toward a line of trees. Beyond them, hidden in a dip in the land, was an old barn house fallen, leaning like a weary giant. Rube had spotted it weeks earlier during one of his scouting trips. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and shelter meant time. Time meant hope. "Head for that barn," he said. "They won't see us from the valley." Carver nodded weakly. "Lead the way." They climbed out of the creek and moved quickly through the tall grass, keeping low, using every shadow to hide their movements. Behind them, the shouts grew louder. Dogs barked. Hoofbeats thundered across the valley floor. The chase was reaching its final moments. They reached the barn as clouds gathered above, casting long gray shadows over the broken roof and splintered walls. The wood groaned as Rube pushed open the half-hinged door. Dust rose into the air, and the smell of old hay filled their lungs. Inside, the barn was dark except for thin beams of sunlight slipping through cracks in the boards. Rube motioned for Carver to sit behind a stack of fallen lumber. "We'll rest here," Rube said softly. "Catch our breath." Carver slid down the wall, exhausted, sweat mixed with dust on his face. "Rube, we're trapped, aren't we?" Rube didn't answer immediately. He walked to a small opening in the boards and looked out. He could see movement in the distance, tiny shapes of riders spreading across the land. They were searching every hill, every path, every hidden place. Finally, he said, "We're not trapped yet." But his voice carried a weight that told a different story. Carver closed his eyes. "You know, for a while there, I thought we had a chance. Thought we could outrun all this." Rube looked away. "We had a long run, longer than most." Silence settled inside the barn. Dust drifted in the air. Outside, the wind pushed against the old wood, making it creak softly. Rube stood still, thinking. His mind moved through possibilities, like pieces on a chessboard. But for once, every move seemed blocked. Then, faint but unmistakable, he heard footsteps approaching the barn. Carver's eyes snapped open. "They're here." Rube raised a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. He listened carefully. Boots crunching on dirt, metal clinking. Low voices, whispering commands. The posse had spread out, forming a ring around the barn. Pinkerton Stroud stepped forward, shouting, "Burrow, we know you're in there. There's no way out." Carver grabbed his gun with shaky hands. "Rube, what do we do?" Rube looked at him, calm despite the danger. "We don't fire unless we have to. No one dies today if we can help it." But the lawmen had no intention of waiting. A moment later, a shot rang out and punched through the barn wall. Splinters burst across the floor. Carver ducked. "They ain't waiting." Rube felt something shift inside him, a deep understanding that this was the moment everything had been leading to. Years of robberies, months of running, weeks of betrayal. It all came down to this. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. Carver grabbed his arm. "Rube, no." Rube looked at him with steady eyes. "I'm tired of running, and if they catch us hiding, they'll kill us anyway." Another shot hit the barn. More shouts. More boots. The circle was tightening. Rube opened the door slowly and stepped outside. Hands raised, but eyes unbroken. The posse aimed their guns. Dust swirled around them. Jim stood near the back, pale and shaking, unable to meet Rube's gaze. Pinkerton Stroud stepped forward. "Rube Burrow," he said loudly, "you're under arrest." Rube stayed silent. His eyes scanned the faces around him. The fear, the anger, the determination. Finally, he spoke. "No one gets hurt," he said calmly. "That's all I ask." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, a deputy, nervous and inexperienced, fired too early. The bullet grazed Rube's arm. He winced, but didn't fall. Carver shouted from inside the barn, returning fire in panic. The posse ducked. Shouts filled the air. Horses reared. Dust exploded upward. Rube turned toward the barn. "Carver, stop." But it was too late. A second wave of gunfire thundered across the field. Rube stumbled backward, clutching his side. His vision blurred. The world tilted. He dropped to one knee, breathing hard. Jim watched with horror. Tears filled his eyes, not from fear, but from shame. Rube looked up at him. Their eyes met for one heavy second. Jim whispered, "I'm sorry." Rube gave a faint nod and expression, not of anger, but of acceptance. Pinkerton Stroud approached carefully, gun lowered. "It's over, Burrow." Rube took one final breath, steady and calm, the way he had lived all his life. The wind drifted across the field. The sun pushed through the clouds, and with a slow exhale, Rube Burrow fell. The posse quieted. Birds began to sing again in the nearby trees. Jim knelt beside Rube's still form, shaking with guilt. Carver was dragged from the barn, shouting Rube's name until his voice broke. The legend of Rube Burrow, the phantom train robber, ended that day. Not with riches, not with glory, but with the calm dignity of a man who faced the world on his own terms. His story traveled across newspapers. His name entered history. Some called him a criminal, others called him a hero. But all agreed on one thing: he was the last great train robber of the American South, a man who defied the odds until the very end.